Recently, Piers Morgan hosted Christian apologists Andrew Wilson and Jay Dyer in a debate with atheists Parker and Danny after they confronted Jordan Peterson on Jubilee. And it's a debate that can only be described as a train wreck. So I don't know what you think, Alex.
The dumpster fire also sort of sprung to mind.
Shit show, I think, was Danny said to us after we did the recording. So look, we're not going to review the whole thing. We're not going to go into all the cultural or politics. But I thought I'd just get Alex and Malpass on to do like a quick comment on the tiny bit of the, I don't know, what was an hour discussion that actually touched on some philosophical content. So we've just got one clip we're going to review, and it's Jay Dyer talking about morality, the is-ought gap, so let's have a look at that one clip, and then Alex will explain what's going wrong.
Earlier in the first section, when we talked about Peterson, we were talking about what was good for men.
Yeah.
And whether Tate was good or Peterson was good. And now we're talking about ethics in the sexual domain, which there's no basis in their worldview for anything to be morally, objectively right or wrong, other than their personal preferences. So if there's nothing objectively wrong, there's no reason why bigotry is wrong. Why is bigotry wrong?
Well, I support your claim. Don't run from your claim. Support it, right? We have no. You're saying we as atheists have no basis of morality. Support that.
Yeah, no epistemic basis for getting an ought from an is.
Yeah, that's a claim. Okay, well, you're saying atheists.
No, it's an argument. It's a famous argument,
right? You're saying that atheists can't account for morality. So what's the argument for that?
You can't get an ought from an is the argument. Back to Hume.
It looks like you don't know what an argument is. Come on, reason. Try to go from one line of reasoning to another. Do you know what an argument is?
You cannot get an ought from an is. You're an atheist. In a materialistic worldview, there's no oughts.
What does that have to do with atheism?
In a materialistic, atheistic worldview, there are no oughts.
First of all, I'm not a materialist.
You don't know the basic problem of ought from
is. That's just another claim. That's just another
claim. It's an argument. It's a famous historical.
Look,
you don't know the difference between a claim and an argument.
Claim, you can't defend it.
It's an argument. It goes back to David Hume.
You don't
know that.
Right?
You don't know the difference between.
Look what just happened. Look what just happened. This guy said.
What just happened is that you didn't know the difference between an argument and a claim.
Why are you ever talking to me? Why are you scared? Let me talk, right? You just claimed that atheists don't have a foundation of morality. I asked you to defend it, and then you said you can't get an ought from an is. What the heck?
That's the argument. That's correct.
Where are you going to get from that premise, right? You can't derive that.
It's an argument. It's not a premise. It goes back to David Hume. You just didn't know that.
Alex, why don't you unpack this is-ought gap argument for those that aren't familiar with it, and we can see what's really going on here.
Okay, so I think the first thing to say is that Jay Dyer is like a sort of cyber bully pseudo-intellectual who throws around big words to try and dominate his interlocutors. And that probably is reasonably successful as a strategy, I guess, if you are not an expert in what he's talking about. And he certainly carries himself with a lot of confidence, self-confidence. And sometimes people just like watching someone who sort of represents their clan beating up on someone who represents the other clan. Fine. So I sort of understand in a way that he's got fans and a following. On the other hand, I'm amazed he's got any fans or a following, because the guy's very unlikable, it seems to me. I mean, maybe it's just because I'm on the other side of the fence or something. He seems utterly humorless, intolerant bigot, effectively.
Isn't he a comedian, actually?
Well, it's one thing to sort of self-identify as a comedian, but it seems to me that there's more to being a comedian than simply self-identifying as one, right? You actually have to be funny, for one thing. And I can't imagine how he's got any kind of comedy routine going. Maybe he does. Maybe I'm just wrong about that. But any interaction I've ever seen with him, he's utterly humorless. And he tried to do a joke, I think, in this exchange. He tried to do a Jordan Peterson impression at the beginning. And it was very bizarre. And it was a supremely awkward moment where nobody seemed to laugh. Everyone seemed to be like, what's happened to his voice? Why is he talking like that? And then everyone was like, oh, he's doing a Jordan Peterson. I guess he's doing a Jordan Peterson impression.
All right, Alex, but I want to read out the quote from Hume himself, and then you can unpack it and explain what's going on here, right? So this is what I have. Quote, in every system of morality which I've hitherto met with, I've always remarked that the author proceeds from some time in the ordinary way of reasoning and establishes the being of a God, or makes observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions, is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought, or an ought not. The change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence, close quote. So unpack that for us. What's going on here? How is it relating to what Jay Dyer said?
Right. So Jay is like using Hume to sort of beat Danny over the head with saying, oh, you don't know, this argument goes back to Hume. And this passage is normally credited with being a bit of Hume. So this is in his Treatise of Human Nature, of Human Understanding, I think it's called. All the Locke and Hume and all you have these books that all sound exactly the same. So anyway, it's taken to mean in the contemporary literature is he's saying something like, if we see an argument where the premises are entirely descriptive, and what we mean by descriptive here is that they just have no evaluative terms, no normative terms, things like ought or good or right or wrong, those types of like moral, if we like moral, it doesn't have to be moral, but in this case it is moral, those sorts of terms. And it just includes descriptive phrases like, this thing is over here, that thing's wet, this thing's sandy, whatever, those types of bare descriptive premises. We're saying if all the premises are completely descriptive and the conclusion is normative, it has some normative terms, then that's not going to be a valid argument, right? That what's happened is we've got something out of the argument that we didn't put in, and this sort of breaks a sort of informal idea of how logic works, right? That it only really gives you outputs, that reformings of things that you've put in the first place. So Hume's saying, where did this normative stuff come from, right? We've been talking about merely descriptive stuff, and now you've concluded something normative. So he thinks this is a significant observation that undermines it subverts all the vulgar systems of morality. Right? So he thinks it's a super important insight that he's had, which will be relevant to all vulgar forms of morality. So he's got his own account of what morality is, but he thinks that it's a kind of unnoticed issue that other systems of morality have to face. So let's try and break it down with an example. So I think to make it a bit more easy to understand. So I might say something like punching people in the face causes them pain, right?
Yep.
Premise one, and then the conclusion I infer from that is just you ought not punch people in the face, right? So punching people causes them pain, therefore you shouldn't punch them in the face. Now, you might say intuitively feels pretty reasonable as a thing, so why not? What's wrong with that, right? I might think that the premise is true and that the conclusion is true, so isn't that fine? Well, maybe, but the point is that the conclusion isn't necessary because of the premise, right? It could be that the premise is true and the conclusion is false, right? There's no actual contradiction in supposing punching someone causes them pain, and yet it's not wrong to punch them in the face, right? Maybe it's
saying one doesn't follow from the other. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right, exactly. Even though you would nod along to both of them, logic isn't compelling you to accept the conclusion just because you've accepted the premise. So how might we rectify that so that it is logically valid? Well, the sort of standard thing to think is that you'd introduce a new premise, which may have been implicit anyway in what you were thinking. But if we bring it out and make it explicit, then that will more clearly show how the premises then actually do logically entail the conclusion. So, for instance, the bridge premise here might be something like, if causing anything that causes somebody harm is wrong, right? So now we've got, if I punch someone in the face, it causes them harm, premise one. Premise two is anything that causes someone harm is wrong. Now the conclusion, punching someone in the face is wrong, right? Now it just follows inescapably. There's no way that you could accept the premises and not accept the conclusion. There actually would be a contradiction in supposing that the premises are true and the conclusion was false. So now logic, there we go. So it works fine. So we can derive normative conclusions, but didn't I just say that we couldn't do that? Yeah. Well, what we've done is we've introduced this bridge premise in, and the bridge premise itself has a normative term in it, right? Because we said anything that causes harm is wrong. So we've introduced the normative term into the premise. And that's the only way that you can make it so that the conclusion actually drops out of those premises, is if we have introduced the normative term in the beginning, because as we said in the first place, this intuitive idea of logic is that if you don't get anything out that you didn't put in, and that's so the only way we can get it out is if we put it in the first place. So let's wheel this back a little bit. Hopefully that's explained. I mean, is that clear to you? I mean,
no, I think that's very clear. So this is the famous is or gap, basically.
Yeah.
If you want an or, you kind of have to have an or in there in the first place.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. So it's specifically about arguments, and it's just about if all the premises are descriptive, then the conclusion is going to have to be, at best, also descriptive. Can't be normative. For it to be normative, at least some of the inputs have to be normative too. That's all that Hume is insisting on, right?
Right.
So, what we might say is let's take. I mean, what I was talking about a moment ago with the punching is quite similar to something that you might see in Sam Harris. So he'll say something like, if I don't know, doing some particular action, increases well-being, then it's good, right? Then we ought to do that, something like that. So Sam Harris will, I think, is guilty of fudging this is-ought gap because he introduces descriptive premises and thinks that he's deriving normative conclusions, but without the kind of explicit bridge premise that I was talking about, which would actually put the normative stuff into the inputs. He thinks he's defying this is-ought gap or whatever. So he might say something like, if, I don't know, helping old ladies across the road increases their well-being, right? The premise one, helping old ladies across the road increases their well-being. Premise two, we ought to help old ladies across the road or something. Right? But again, same reason, it doesn't follow logically. You'd have to say something like anything that increases well-being is what we ought to do. And unless you add that in the first place, you're not going to get it out. Right? So in a way, you can see how someone might think, oh, the is-ought gap, that ruins atheistic accounts of morality, because we just did that. We just ruined Sam Harris's account of morality with this.
And a lot of people might think that Sam Harris's account is like the only atheistic account there is. So it looks like, oops, we've torpedoed atheistic morality. But have we?
Yes. Well, you might have torpedoed Sam Harris's atheistic morality. So I mean, it's not like he's off the hook. But the thing I think that's important to notice is that the target of Hume's ire was just all of the vulgar systems of morality. He was
just clarify what you mean by vulgar there, because that's going to be a phrase that not everyone is going to know what he's referring to.
Well, so Hume's a 19th century, 18th century author. That's right, and speaks in those old-fashioned words. So often his terminology is slightly different from how we use it nowadays. Vulgar meaning sort of rude or inappropriate or something like that. But I think, and I'm not a Hume scholar enough to know the subtleties of all of the words he uses, I take it that what he means in this case is that those systems of morality that are not compatible with his epistemology. And that's what makes them vulgar, right? It's because they're supposing some system of epistemology that's kind of primitive or juvenile or religious or something like that. So he's going to call that vulgar. But he's happy to talk about secular accounts of morality just as much as religious ones. And that's really the point here, is that he's not, Hume is maybe a deist, maybe an agnostic, maybe an atheist. He's certainly not a Christian, right? He's extraordinarily vocally anti-Christian in much of his writings, at least in his stuff on miracles. So it'd be a bit weird if David Hume was the guy who destroyed atheistic morality. If he was the guy who showed that you can only have morals if God exists, well, then he wouldn't be David Hume, he'd be William Lane Craig. So how come, right? What's going on? The thing to think about is that this argument's really got nothing to do with whether God is in the picture or not, right? And the point applies just as well, even if God is in the picture. So we looked at the Sam Harris example. So now let's look at a religious version of how religious meta-ethics. So you might have divine command theory, which would say something like, God commands you not to murder. And then the conclusion might be, therefore, you ought not murder, right? And that does seem like a not completely uncharitable rendering of how people understand those commandments, as they carry normative force. They're not just like, if I say shut the door, doesn't mean you ought shut the door. You could, maybe just tell me to go away or shut up or something. I don't have the authority to introduce normative constraints upon you. At least not in that example. But you might say, well, God does, so that's the way out of this or something. But it doesn't change the issue fundamentally, because if I just have a descriptive premise, God says, don't do this, therefore you ought not do this. It's just logically invalid in exactly the same way. So when we looked at the Sam Harris one, right? Because the premise is entirely descriptive. It doesn't carry any normative content. So how are you going to get it in the conclusion? So what you'd need to do if you were a theist and wanted to avoid, and if you were a divine command theorist, for instance, and wanted to avoid this is-ought gap introduced by Hume is you'd have to do the very same thing. You'd have to introduce a bridging premise, which said something like, if God tells you not to do X, you ought not to do X, right? And without that being introduced as a bridge premise, it's not going to fix the argument. So it's like, I think what's going on here is that Jay thought that Hume somehow was showing that only atheists couldn't have morality or something, but actually Hume's point applies to everybody. At least anyone who's trying to get away with deriving normative conclusions from purely descriptive premises. So if there's some strategy that allows the theist to get around this, it seems like you'd probably be able to mimic it to get the atheist around it too. But Jay doesn't seem interested in that at all. All he wanted to do was say, it's the is-ought gap. You don't know about Hume. I do know about Hume. But he's introduced a problem from Hume that has nothing to do with atheists or Christians. It applies to everybody the same, equally. You don't get out of this problem merely by positing a God. Or if he thinks that he can get out of this by positing a God, he owes us quite a big story about how that happens, right? So I think fundamentally he's just sort of used a weapon that's it's like a double-edged sword, and it hurts him just as much as it hurts Danny. It's kind of pointless to bring into a fight something that undermines your position as much as the opponent's position.
Right. So it's almost like a bomb. You can drop it on anyone, right? And no one's got any defense.
Yeah.
That's specific to them. I mean, you can have a defense. Anyone can bring in a bridging premise, but you need that bridging premise, and the theist needs it just as much as the atheist needs it. There's no distinction between the two.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. So just simply saying, well, God is, if you wanted to say, look, God is the creator of the universe, so you should listen to him or something. Again, that's just descriptive. So it falls prey to the same thing. If you say, well, he's all powerful and he could put you in hell if you don't do what he says. Cool. Maybe that introduces a pragmatic reason for me to do what he says, but it doesn't justify deriving a normative claim from it, because just because a big strong man says that you should do something doesn't actually introduce a normative constraint on your actions. Maybe pragmatic, but not normative. So it's like, what can the theist appeal to? Well, what they could say is that God is God is by definition the good. So God and the good are the same thing. In which case, I think you still have to tell me something about why what he says means that introduces as a normative aspect to it. But still, if what we're allowed to do is sort of appeal to definitions, then atheists could certainly do the same sort of thing. Because
so can I say as an atheist, like, well, it just is good to help your fellow human. That's just what the good is. So we'd be in the same boat, wouldn't we?
It seems to me that you would. So sometimes these sorts of arguments are called like partners in crime. So it's like, I can introduce it, but like a radical skeptical scenario. How do you know you're not dreaming or something? Well, how do you know you're not dreaming? We can both drop the dreaming bomb if we want to, but it doesn't help me any more than it helps you. So if either of us is going to put that to one side, we should let the other one do.
That was used a lot in the debate between William Lane Craig and, was it Wellenberg, I think? And he basically said, I've got this problem, so do you.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So here it is exactly what's going on, is that what Jay's doing is he's introducing a problem that, to the extent that it's a problem for anybody, is a problem for both of them. And he doesn't have a special way out of it that wouldn't be something that, in this case, Danny could have appealed to himself. The other thing, I think we've probably done enough to explain what Hume's problem is and how it applies to both of them, and maybe there's some way out, but they could both take it if either of them could. The other thing that I think I want to say about this is just that, Dyer's not well-read, studious, knowledgeable person in general, very uber confident, but not actually got much academic rigor behind him to back up this stuff. So he often presents different versions of the same idea without recognizing that there are differences between them. But when I had a debate with him, he was all over the place on things like the transcendental method and whether Aristotle was doing and stuff like that. Right? He waffled backwards and forwards between different things. In a way, it's good, almost like a Gish Gallop way of defending yourself, because if you don't actually say anything precise, it's very difficult to sort of actually be refuted. But one of the things he said was that the atheist lacks the epistemological justification, I think, something like that, for morality. Well, it's true that Hume's empiricism is such that what Hume wants to say is basically everything that you know that's a matter of fact, right? That's not just a pure abstract relation of ideas, real concrete matters of fact. This object is at this position at this time, this thing has this property, whatever, those types of things. They're fundamentally known to the senses. It might not be yours, but somebody somewhere has seen it for themselves or tasted it for themselves or something. It's an empiricist. That's what that means. So for him, if he looks at a situation where there's two people, one's punching the other one in the face, he's going to say something like, I can see the fist hitting the cheek and the crunch of the jawbone and the whelp of noise or whatever, all of those things. I just can't see anything normative here. There's just nothing. I can't actually see the wrongness of it. I can just see the specific things that are happening. So for Hume, he's not going to say, because he's an empiricist, he's not going to say, well, nevertheless, I think there is something called moral value and it's just not accessible to my senses. As a good empiricist, consistent empiricist, he has to find something else to ground morality. And he does, right? He's got a whole system of how morality works. And it's basically a version of subjectivism. If you adopted Hume's epistemology, then you would find that you're reluctant to say that objective morality exists. Fair enough, right? But an atheist doesn't have to accept Hume's epistemology, doesn't have to be an empiricist of that type. So instead of saying, I won't believe it unless my senses can sort of demonstrate it to me, what you might do is say something else. Typically something like, I'll believe it if I can see it. Empiricism is good when it's available, but in other cases, I'm still going to believe in things I can't see sometimes. And other criteria have been added in. So, for instance, another famous criteria would be that I'll believe in something even if I can't see it, if it's indispensable in explaining something that I can see. So you might see, to take a physics example, you might not actually be able to see an electron or something, but you can see the effects that the electron passing through the cloud chamber has. Yeah. Right? So I see the cloud sort of swishing or whatever happens when an electron goes through a cloud chamber. That's what I can see. And the best explanation, an explanation that's basically indispensable, given everything else I know, is that there's a thing in there, an electron, and that's what's making this happen. Or the perturbation of the orbit of Neptune, which was Uranus, or is it the other way around?
Okay, it was Uranus that had a weird orbit, and Neptune was inferred.
Yes,
because of Uranus's weird orbit. Yeah,
right, and so that's the same sort of thing. Is that you don't actually have to see this mysterious planet. It's a solid explanation based on what we can see. Another example of that is Quine wanted to say that you can believe that there are such things as numbers, abstract objects, because they're just indispensable for doing science and mathematics and stuff. Or you might say, I believe in imaginary numbers because they're indispensable to quantum mechanics, right? So we don't have to just be like Hume, right? Yeah. Lots of stuff has happened since Hume. An atheist isn't therefore a Humean in his epistemology. I think Hume's got an interesting and well-developed epistemology, but you're not saddled with it just because you don't believe in God, right? So you don't get to just tell an atheist, like Jay Dyer is just telling Danny, you are an empiricist, effectively, and that's why you don't have an epistemological justification for morals. So that was one way he presented it. It's got nothing to do with the years-old gap of David Hume, which has got nothing to do with your epistemology. It's just the premise is descriptive. That's got nothing to do with your epistemology, right? It's just completely independent. And then one last interpretation that Jay also gave, just because he's spewing almost word salad whenever he says this stuff. The other one was he said something like, well, as a materialist atheist, right? We've heard this one again and again, right? This cliche that the fallacy of the materialist atheist, right? As a materialist atheist, there are no values because values aren't made of material, so you just can't have them, right? So game over, Danny. But this is done because atheists don't have to be materialists, right? Arguably, materialism doesn't really make any sense if you take more nuanced understanding from physics. And you can tell me better than I can tell you, but stuff like what even are particles? Do they even exist in the places and times? What is material if it's not like a billiard ball that sits in a specific place and time? And we know particles don't act like that. Then energy, fields, all this stuff, it's not exactly material, right? But it's the bedrock of what we consider to be physics these days. So,
it's hard to, I think in the 19th century, you kind of knew what materials were, bricks, wood and things like that. And as science has gone deeper and deeper into more fundamental levels, and you find, well, at the fundamental level, as far as we can tell, there are like quantum fields, and particles are like the excitations of quantum fields. Is that material? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I haven't heard a concrete definition of what material is. But I mean, maybe I can be a little bit generous to Jay Dyer and say, well, material is anything that follows the laws of physics. In that sense, I guess quantum fields would be materials. What then?
Okay, so if you say everything that exists obeys the laws of quantum mechanics, so that's this version of materialism then, in that case. Okay, great. If you take that view, then you're gonna face an issue if you try and say there's something called a moral law or a moral principle or something, moral truth even. Well, does it obey the laws of quantum mechanics? Maybe you could cook up a story in which it does. I don't know, but probably it's going to be quite tough to actually cash that out. So you might have to say something like that everything apart from this does, which starts to look a bit ad hoc, or you might want to just say, listen, I guess in that sense, it's not entirely objective, but you could do something like Sam Harris, where you go, here's a naturally occurring phenomenon, a brain state of this type, and I'm going to say that being in that brain state type is good. And that's where I'm going to just sort of, like we were saying before, it could be like a thick moral property. And so that would be a version of, in metaethics, it's called naturalism, where what you're doing is saying there's this talk about morality, and it can be exchanged for a logically equivalent paragraph or a phrase or something that means the same thing but doesn't use normative terminology. So some description of like well-being or whatever. And you could do, and that's fine. But let's also remember that like that's what the theist is doing here too. So when Jay says you don't have any objective theory of morality, if we go back to this sort of hobby horse divine command theory, that's also not objective in that strong sense either, because it's just another version of naturalism, right? It's just an attempt to give a paraphrase for X is wrong, just means God tells you not to do X or something, right? You ought not do X just means God's commanded you not to do X, something like that.
And let's just back up, the naturalism here doesn't mean naturalism in the context of like naturalism versus supernaturalism.
That's right, yeah.
It's naturalism is based on some fact about the world. Is that
so
right?
So in fact, that's not normative. It's something, there's something you can reduce normative terminology to that's not normative itself, right? So maybe an example, a better term for this would be sort of reductionism about moral properties, right? That they reduce or they emerge, something like that, from something else that's not itself moral. But the point is just that like when the theist offers his candidate reduction of X is good means God commands you to do X, that's just another version of the same type of thing. The thing I think if I was there and Jay was trying to hit me over the head with this, and I had the chance to speak, which I probably wouldn't do, try and explain
on the Piers Morgan show.
Yeah, I wouldn't be on the Piers Morgan show for one thing, but I would try and explain this, that like none of these considerations count for or against Christians versus atheists, right? It's just an orthogonal distinction. It's at 90 degrees and it's got nothing to do with the other. So fundamentally, I think the last thing to say is that Jay is basically just Ponce who goes around pretending that he's really clever, and really he just likes expressing his anger at other people and dominating them in public, which is just what a bully does. A cyber bully is what I think, that's what I said in the first place. And people like that, when they are trying to talk in uber confident terms about philosophy, deserve other people to come along and poke holes in it and say that you're getting it wrong. I wouldn't be mean to someone if they sincerely had a misunderstanding about David Hume. I just think Jay Dyer can't be bothered to go and check anything and just wants to throw these terms around. And he introduced this term without realizing, introduced this idea of the is-ought gap without realizing that it cuts both ways. It's like he was having a fist fight with Danny and then he got a grenade out. That's not going to help either. Either bad news for both of you, or it doesn't matter. That's what happened.
And to be fair to Danny, I'm sure Danny knew this very, very well, and he challenged him to make the argument, hoping that he would trip up. But he didn't even make the argument. He just sort of dropped the term is-ought gap, referenced David Hume, and just left it there. So let me just get one last thing before we finish up. Now, interestingly, Danny said that he's an atheist, but not a materialist. And, when we debate Christians, they often assume that these two things are the same. So maybe you can give one or two examples of someone being an atheist but not a materialist.
Well, I mean, it's you could be okay. So, if from the history of philosophy, for instance, Bertrand Russell was obviously an atheist, right? But Russell, when he was a child, read Euclid's geometry and fell in love with formal sciences as a result. But in his biography, he said that it was because his parents died really young, so he went to live with his grandparents. And then his grandparents died, and the only person he had left was his brother and his whole family. Well, I guess he had extended family, whatever. But he, as a small child, he's very isolated, and he felt comfort in reading the kind of serene axioms of Euclidean geometry, which don't change, and it's this beautiful paradise where everything works perfectly. Right? So as a child, he felt sort of safe reading this environment where people wouldn't leave you. The triangles will never leave me. They're always going to be there. But that, I think, opened him up to the idea of this sort of Platonistic view about philosophy of maths. So unless I'm making a massive blunder and confusing myself, I'm pretty sure Russell's a Platonist and believed in abstract objects. So did Kurt Gödel, for instance. So there's many mathematicians or philosophers of maths who would advocate that there are such things as numbers. So they're not going to say that they're material things.
Gödel was a theist, of course. So
yeah, in his own way.
Penrose as an example, he's a mathematical Platonist and he's also an atheist.
There you go. So, okay, great. So you can certainly be mathematical Platonist and not believe in and be an atheist at the same time. So I mean, basically the point is just that like the philosophy comes and goes in trends and fashions, and for a period in the 20th century, everyone was being very, very reductive. You get this kind of Vienna Circle, logical positivist stuff going on. Everyone wanted to really more extreme empiricism even than Hume. And then people kind of went off in a different direction. That's where we get Quine saying stuff like, well, if it's indispensable for our best science, it's okay to believe in it, even though it doesn't have this kind of direct observation link. So that just opens the door to you to be able to say, listen, I'm a sort of scientist. I'm not religious in any way, but still I think that there's some stuff out there that I can't directly observe myself. And that just opens the door to non-material, believing in stuff that's non-material. It doesn't mean that you believe now in goblins and elves and witches and anything, because you can still be kind of rigorous and scientific about it, just like you believe in Neptune before you directly see it. It's just that type of thing. It allows you to make inferences, right? Like I don't want to get too deep into the word because we keep talking about this forever, but there's this view in science that theories don't, they kind of like earn their keep by maximizing a kind of balance between the theoretical work that it does, the explanation that the theory allows you, and the balance is off against the ontological commitments that they're basically cost. It's like a cost-benefit thing. Now, what's going on here is that you're trying to find the theory that has the best overall balance between these things. It needs to explain all the stuff that I need to explain. Why does this thing dissolve in water? Why does that thing fly? Whatever. But it also needs to do so without extraneously positing unnecessary objects. Like there's some goblin that keeps the things up and that's why they fly. You just can't see them or something. If you can get away without positing things like that in there, then the theory is intuitively better. Right? Now that method doesn't rely on any assumptions about only material things exist or only things that obey quantum mechanics exist. I mean, anything, as long as it's paying for itself in that sort of theoretical economy, could earn its keep and therefore be something that you believe in, right? So this is kind of Quinean post-empiricist rationality that's basically the bedrock of contemporary scientific philosophical thought, seems to me. So yeah, there's just like it's just like the way Jay Dyer talks about it. It's just so out of touch. He just doesn't know what he's talking about. Basically, he's assuming you have to be like this 17th century materialist or whatever. And no, that's not how it works.
Right. So to sum up, the is or gap got nothing to do with the atheism-theism debate.
Absolutely,
it's not relevant. You don't have to be a materialist if you're an atheist. You can be if you want, but you don't have to be. And, there's a whole debate about morality. Is it objective? Is it subjective? All kinds of different categories. And again, nothing to do with atheism, theism. They're just orthogonal, basically.
Yeah.
So don't drop Hume with the is or gap and say that is it going to be some sort of defeater for atheism. Is that a fair sum up?
Absolutely, yeah.
All right. Well, look, what do you think, guys? Let us know in the comments. And if you like this content, give us a like and subscribe to the channel.